Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. The campfire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the towering trees. I sat on a fallen log, poking at the flames with a stick, listening to the sounds of the forest breathing around me. Night had fallen fast, draping the woods in an impenetrable blackness, the stars obscured by thick clouds. It was the kind of darkness that swallowed your thoughts, made your skin prickle with unseen threats. I've been a park ranger in this remote stretch of forest for 6 years, and I've never felt unnerved by it. Not until tonight. It started with the sound, a soft rhythmic tapping in the distance, almost imperceptible over the wind rustling the leaves. At first I thought it might be a woodpecker, though it was too late for any bird to be active. Then the tapping grew louder, closer, like a stick rapping against tree bark in an almost deliberate pattern. I stood up, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark like a knife, but all it revealed were trees, thick and motionless. Still, the tapping continued, echoing faintly through the woods. It was unnerving, that sound, too methodical for an animal, too random for a person. "Hello?" I called, though my voice seemed to sink into the night, unheard by anyone but myself. I waited, listening intently for a response. Silence. I convinced myself it was nothing, just the forest playing tricks on me. I've heard strange sounds out here before. Animals, creaking branches, the wind making odd noises as it passed through the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling crawling up my spine. As I settled back down by the fire, I noticed something just beyond the reach of the firelight. At the edge of the clearing, there was something off. A figure, I thought. My eyes tried to adjust to the dark, but it was impossible to make out clearly. It looked like a person, standing perfectly still, just watching me. I swallowed hard, squinting into the blackness. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. The figure didn't move. I flicked my flashlight back on and aimed it at the spot, but there was nothing there. My heart hammered in my chest. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Whatever I had seen was gone, if it had been there at all. I stood up again, scanning the tree line, my breath hitching slightly. I could feel something watching me, just out of sight. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence, the kind that weighs heavy on your ears. That's when I noticed the smell, rotten, sickly sweet. It hit me like a wave, so sudden and intense that I gagged. It was like something was decomposing, the odor of death hanging thick in the air. But there was no sign of any carcass nearby, no animal remains. The smell seemed to come from nowhere, and it made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the walkie-talkie clipped to my belt crackled to life. I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Carter, you out there?" The voice was static-filled, barely recognizable as my colleague, Jeff. He was stationed miles away, at the next ranger post. I grabbed the radio, pressing the button to respond. "Yeah, Jeff, I'm here. What's up?" There was a pause, and then his voice came through again, more distorted this time. "You should leave." I furrowed my brow, holding the radio closer. "What do you mean, leave?" "Not safe with you," the voice stuttered. I felt a chill race down my spine. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Jeff, are you okay?" The radio hissed with static, and then his voice cut through, clearer this time. "Carter, I don't know what you're hearing, but I didn't say anything. Just checking in." His tone was casual, completely unaware of the words I'd just heard. I froze. The voice that had told me to leave, it wasn't Jeff. It sounded like him, but now that I thought about it, there was something off about it. Something wrong with the cadence, the way the words had been spoken, like someone trying to mimic him but not quite getting it right. Yeah, all good here," I said, my hand shaking slightly as I clipped the walkie back to my belt. That's when the noises started again, not the tapping this time, but whispers. Low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from every direction at once. I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly through the trees, but there was no one there. And then I saw it. Standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, partially obscured by the trees, was a figure. This time, there was no mistaking it. Tall, gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, too long for a person. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones, and its face, God, its face. It looked like a human face. But something was wrong with it. The eyes were too large, the mouth too wide, as if someone had carved a person out of wax and let it melt slightly in the heat. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The thing tilted its head, watching me with those too large eyes. And then it spoke. "Leave, now," it rasped in Jeff's voice. But the voice was distorted, wrong, just like the one I had heard over the radio. I bolted. I didn't think, didn't even grab my pack. I just ran, my feet pounding against the forest floor, branches whipping against my face as I sprinted blindly through the trees. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. The thing was behind me. I could hear its steps now, heavy and deliberate, like it was in no hurry. It didn't need to be. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station, slamming the door behind me and collapsing against it, gasping for breath. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen, what had been following me. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the creature standing just outside. But it wasn't there. I sank into a chair, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the isolation was finally getting to me. But then I heard the familiar crackle of the radio again, and Jeff's voice came through. "Carter," he said, and my blood turned to ice. "You should have listened. Now it's too late." I stared at the radio, my heart thudding in my chest, dread pooling in my stomach, because the voice wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from right behind me. The late autumn sun dipped low over silverwood pines, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch deeper into the woods. As a park ranger, I had spent countless evenings here, but something felt different about this one. The air was thick with an unsettling quiet, the kind that muffled the usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping crickets. I set up my campsite, the crackling of my fire the only comfort against the encroaching darkness. As night fell, the wind picked up, whistling through the pines like a lost soul. I tried to shake off the chill that crept into my bones, reminding myself that I had faced worse nights. Yet, something was amiss. The fire flickered, casting odd shapes on the trees, and I felt eyes upon me, watching from the shadows. I shook off the sensation and pulled out my book, determined to distract myself. Just as I began to lose myself in the pages, a sound shattered the silence, a soft, eerie hum that seemed to weave through the air. It was a melody unlike any I'd heard, haunting and beautiful. Intrigued yet apprehensive, I closed the book and stood, scanning the darkened forest. The sound drew me in, calling me deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I stepped away from the safety of the firelight, following the melody that danced among the trees. The sound grew louder, echoing off the trunks, wrapping around me like a fog. I ventured further, each step feeling heavier as the shadows deepened. The trees loomed tall, their branches clawing at the sky, their gnarled trunks twisting in grotesque shapes. Then I saw it, a flicker of light ahead glowing softly amidst the trees. Heart pounding, I pressed on, the hum transforming into whispers that seemed to call my name. "Come, come," they urged, and I felt an inexplicable pull toward the source. Emerging into a small clearing, I was met with an unexpected sight. A circle of ancient stones stood before me, each inscribed with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight. In the center of the stones, a figure swayed, cloaked in a dark fabric that obscured its features. my breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me. This was a ritual site, a place of power long forgotten. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face pale and gaunt, eyes like hollow pits that seemed to absorb the light around them. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The whispers intensified, surrounding me, filling my mind with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You shouldn't be here," a voice echoed, chilling me to the core. Suddenly, the figure raised its hand, and the whispers crescendoed into a cacophony of voices. "You've disturbed our peace," it intoned, the sound reverberating through the clearing. I stumbled backward, trying to retreat, but the air around me thickened, pulling me closer to the center of the circle. In a panic, I turned to flee, but the shadows twisted and coiled around my ankles, gripping me tight. I felt a surge of cold wash over me as the figure moved closer, its gaze boring into my soul. "You will pay for your trespass," it hissed, the sound sharp and unforgiving. With a final desperate attempt, I tore myself free from the grip of the shadows and ran, adrenaline surging through my veins. The forest morphed into a blur of darkness and chaos, the whispers still chasing me. I stumbled through the trees, branches clawing at my skin, the night air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Finally, I burst back into the clearing where my fire burned, the warm light a beacon of safety. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The fire crackled, flickering in the night, and for a moment, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But as I looked around, I noticed something was wrong. The firelight illuminated my campsite, yet the forest beyond remained shrouded in darkness, the shadows creeping closer. The whispers had faded, but the sensation of being watched intensified, sending shivers down my spine. I scanned the tree line, my breath hitching as I saw figures emerging from the shadows, their forms indistinct yet menacing. Desperate to escape, I gathered my belongings and fled, the forest closing in behind me. I ran until my lungs burned, my heart pounding in my chest. The trees blurred past me, and all I could think about was getting to the ranger station. But as I neared the entrance to the clearing, something stopped me. A sense of déjà vu washed over me. I was back at the circle of stones, the figures still standing in the shadows. I fell to my knees, panic enveloping me. The whispers returned, swirling around me, wrapping tighter like a noose. "You cannot leave," they chanted, the chorus echoing in my mind. "You are one of us now." In that moment, the truth hit me like a tidal wave. I was not the first to stumble upon this place, nor would I be the last. The figures that haunted the woods were the remnants of those who had come before me, lost souls trapped in a cycle of despair. I had become part of the forest, entwined with its ancient magic. The last thing I remember before the darkness consumed me was the figure with the hollow eyes stepping forward, its voice soothing yet sinister. "Welcome home." Now, as I stand in the shadows, watching the next unwary traveler wander into my woods, I realize I am no longer the park ranger. I am the forest, forever entwined in its haunting embrace, waiting for the next to heed the call of silverwood pines. They told me the woods were haunted, but I didn't believe it. I'd been a ranger for over a decade, and I'd heard all the tales. Every park has its own myths, stories spun by locals to spook tourists, keep kids from wandering off. But Dead Hollow, it had more stories than most. It was a thick patch of forest far from any real civilization, full of ancient trees and dense shadows. I'd been assigned to patrol the area for the summer, and I felt more excited than scared. On my second night out there, I noticed something strange. The animals were silent. Normally, there'd be the sound of crickets, owls, maybe the rustle of a deer moving through the underbrush. But that night, the forest was completely still, like a predator was nearby, one that even the trees seemed to fear. I shook it off and went about my rounds. Around midnight, I came across a campsite, one that wasn't supposed to be there. No permit had been issued for this area, and it was miles from any designated spot. The campfire was still smoldering, but there was no sign of people. Tents were there, zipped up tight, but no voices, no movement. I called out, announcing myself as a ranger. Nothing. Only silence. Curious, I approached one of the tents and unzipped it. Inside, there were blankets, a couple of backpacks, but no personal belongings, no clothes, no food, nothing to indicate someone had actually been there. A chill ran through me as I moved to the next tent, repeating the process. Empty. Every single one of them. It was as if whoever had camped here had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the faintest trace of their presence. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it, I heard a sound that nearly stopped my heart, a soft whispering coming from the trees. It wasn't the wind. It had a rhythm, a cadence, like a chant. I couldn't make out the words, but it felt old, ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. I backed away from the campsite, my flashlight flickering as if in warning. I was only a few paces down the trail when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. There in the shadows stood a figure. It was tall, its limbs too long, its face obscured by darkness. But its eyes glowed like embers, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I took a step back, and it took a step forward, matching me, mirroring me. It moved with a strange, jerky motion, like it wasn't used to its own body, like it was trying to remember how to be human. I felt rooted to the spot, the hair on my neck standing up as it began to speak. But the voice that came out of it wasn't a single voice. It was many, layered and intertwined, echoing through the trees. "Stay," it said. "Stay with us." I stumbled backward, breaking the trance, and sprinted down the trail. I didn't stop until I reached the old ranger's cabin, my heart hammering in my chest. I slammed the door shut, leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. I knew I couldn't stay there forever, but I needed a moment to think, to make sense of what I'd just seen. That's when I noticed something strange. The room felt colder, darker, like the shadows were pressing in. I flicked on the lights, but they barely cut through the gloom. I grabbed my radio, but all I got was static, a low, grating hiss that seemed to fill the room. And then, the whispering started again, this time inside the cabin. I spun around, flashlight raised, and saw them. Figures standing just beyond the reach of the light, their eyes glowing, their mouths moving in silent chants. They were all around me, closing in, their forms flickering like they were barely holding together. I felt the walls of the cabin closing in, and then I realized it wasn't a cabin at all. The walls were trees, the ceiling a canopy of branches. I'd been in the forest all along. Panic surged through me as I staggered backward, tripping over roots and fallen branches. I was back in the woods, but something was wrong. The trees had shifted, twisted into unfamiliar shapes. The path I'd taken was gone, replaced by a dense wall of shadows. I was trapped. And then I saw them clearly, those figures, each one with a familiar face, faces I'd seen before. Old photos of rangers who had disappeared over the years, their portraits hanging in the park's office, memorials to those who'd been lost. They were all here, their eyes glowing with the same otherworldly fire, their voices calling to me, beckoning me to join them. I realized then that I was not the first to wander too deep into Dead Hollow, to hear the whispers, to see the figures. I was just the latest, another ranger who thought he could tame these woods. But these creatures, whatever they were, weren't just spirits or monsters. They were the ones who'd come before me, caught in a cycle, trapped, forgotten. And now, they wanted me to join them. I turned to run, but the figures closed in, their faces twisted into smiles that held no warmth. And as they reached for me, I understood their chant, finally hearing the words clearly. "You belong to the forest now." I knew I wouldn't make it out. I would become one of them, another face, another story, another part of the forest's legend. And someday, some new ranger would come, and I would be there, waiting, whispering and calling them to stay. And as I felt myself fading, Merging with the shadows, I realized the truth. Dead Hollow didn't just take you. It remade you, forever binding you to its darkness, a part of its unending story. I remember the trip like it was yesterday, a weekend escape from the noise into the quiet, untouched woods of Black Ridge National Forest. I was always drawn to the wilderness, that ancient, primal feeling of being somewhere truly wild. So, when my friend Mike suggested a camping trip, I jumped at the chance. Just him and me, under the stars, miles from civilization. We arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the dense, towering pines. As we trekked deeper into the forest, I felt that familiar chill. Nature's way of reminding you that out here, you're not in control. It wasn't long before we met the park ranger. He was tall and lanky, with a face that seemed like it hadn't smiled in years. His uniform looked a bit too tight, almost as if it wasn't his. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. Dark, almost hollow, like he'd seen too much of something out here. "Y'all camping out here tonight?" His voice was rough, a little too eager. "Yeah, that's the plan," Mike replied casually. I tried to keep my face neutral, but something about this ranger set me on edge. "You be careful then," he said, his eyes boring into mine. "There are things out here that don't like visitors." He gave a nod and continued down the trail, his steps soundless despite the fallen leaves. Mike shrugged it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with that man. We found a spot by a small clearing and set up camp. As the night crept in, the forest around us seemed to grow thicker, the trees closing in like silent, watchful sentinels. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Around the fire, Mike and I swapped stories, trying to spook each other like we did back in college. But every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that ranger standing there, staring. I didn't tell Mike, but I could feel it. A presence, something just beyond the reach of the firelight watching us. As the night deepened, Mike decided to take a walk. He claimed he wanted to find a good spot to hang our food, but I think he just wanted a moment alone. I stayed by the fire, the shadows stretching around me, swallowing everything that lay beyond its glow. It was strange the way the forest seemed to eat up the light, as if the darkness here was thicker, almost alive. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I heard something moving in the trees. Soft footsteps, barely more than a whisper. I looked around, but Mike wasn't back yet. "Mike?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a weak, flickering glow. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the woods, the beam cutting through the darkness in thin, fragile lines. And then, I saw him, standing just at the edge of the light. "Mike?" I breathed a sigh of relief, but he didn't respond. He was standing unnaturally still, his head tilted slightly as if he was listening for something. His eyes were wrong, empty, almost black, like the ranger's. "Hey, you okay?" I took a step toward him, but he didn't move. His head snapped to the side, and he let out this low, guttural growl, a sound that shouldn't have come from any human throat. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Then he turned and walked into the darkness, his movements jerky, unnatural. I wanted to chase after him, but my legs wouldn't move. Something inside me knew. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't Mike. A twig snapped behind me and I whipped around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Standing there, half hidden by the shadows, was the ranger. His face was twisted, a grotesque smile stretched too wide, and his eyes, they were black as coal. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice now low and distorted. "They don't like it when you're on their land." I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as he took a step forward. But then, in a flash, he was gone. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing whatever I could from the campsite, and bolted into the trees. My only thought was to get out, to run and never look back. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail. The forest was silent again. the oppressive weight of it lifting just enough for me to breathe. I stood there, gasping for air, trying to convince myself it was over. But then I heard it, a faint, familiar voice calling my name. I turned, and there he was, Mike, standing on the trail, looking normal, concerned. "Hey man, what's wrong? I was looking for you." I wanted to believe it was really him, but something in his eyes told me otherwise. They weren't quite right. Still too dark, too empty. He smiled, a slow, twisted grin, and in that moment, I knew. I ran. I left the forest, abandoning my gear, and didn't stop until I reached my car. It's been weeks, and every night I still see them. Mike's face, the ranger's twisted grin, those black, soulless eyes. I filed a missing persons report, but no one's found a trace of him. The official word is that he got lost, maybe taken by a bear. But I know the truth. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can still hear that voice, calling my name, beckoning me back to those woods. And in those moments, I wonder if it's really Mike, or if it's something else. Something wearing his skin, waiting for me to return. I won't go back, not ever. But I can't shake the feeling that one day they'll come for me. And when they do, I know I won't recognize them. Until it's too late. I'm not one to believe in legends. I've always been a skeptical kind of person, ghosts, monsters, just stories I told myself. But that trip last summer, I'll never be able to shake it. I don't even know why I'm telling you this. Maybe I just need someone to believe me, or maybe I just need someone to hear me before things go dark again. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just me and my friend Jake. He's the outdoorsy type, and I figured a weekend in the woods would do us both good. A break from screens, from work, from the monotony of everyday life. We set up our tent by a small, murky lake in the middle of nowhere. The dense forest around us felt like it stretched on forever. No cell service, no sounds other than the occasional rustle of leaves or distant howl, just the two of us under the stars. On the first night, as we were sitting around the fire, we heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming closer, crunching twigs and leaves with each step. My heart stopped, and Jake, who had been mid-sentence, fell silent, his face paling in the firelight. We waited, breathless, as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a park ranger, or at least that's what he appeared to be. His face was mostly hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, and his uniform looked old, like vintage old. It seemed out of place, but at the time I didn't think much of it. He just stood there watching us, not saying a word. "Hey, you scared us," Jake called out, forcing a laugh. "Didn't know anyone else was out here." The ranger nodded, but his eyes, I don't know how to describe them. They were too dark, like twin voids that seemed to suck in all the light from our fire. He finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Not many come out here anymore. It's safer that way." "Safer?" I asked, my curiosity tinged with unease. He just nodded again, slower this time. "You should pack up, leave before sundown tomorrow. The woods aren't kind to strangers." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the trees as if he'd never been there. Jake and I were left staring into the darkness, each of us lost in our own thoughts, but I shrugged it off. Some backwoods warning, I figured, just an old ranger looking to spook some city boys. But Jake, he looked genuinely shaken, and that wasn't like him at all. The next day we tried to enjoy ourselves, but there was this feeling, like we were being watched. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind, it all felt wrong, unnatural. By noon, the sun was already slipping behind a thick layer of clouds, casting a gray, sickly light over the forest. Jake wanted to leave, but I convinced him to stay, saying we'd be fine. That's when we heard it. A low growl echoing through the trees, too deep and guttural to be any animal I knew. It was close, impossibly close, yet there was nothing there. Just the trees and the shadows, twisting into shapes that made my stomach turn. I glanced at Jake, and I could tell he heard it too. He was already reaching for his bag, mumbling something about getting out while we can. We hurried back to our campsite, packing up as fast as we could, but before we could finish, the ranger appeared again. This time he looked different. His eyes were wide, almost feral, and his face, there was something wrong with his face. It looked stretched, distorted, like it wasn't quite his. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was wearing it, like a mask. "You didn't listen," he hissed, and his voice, it wasn't right. It had this eerie, echoing quality, like multiple voices were speaking at once. "Now, you're not alone." The shadows around us began to move, and I could see shapes emerging from the darkness. Tall, hunched figures with glowing eyes and twisted limbs. They were everywhere, surrounding us, cutting off any hope of escape. Jake started to run, but before I could follow, something grabbed me. Its hands, no, claws, dug into my shoulder, cold and unyielding. I was face to face with one of the creatures. Its eyes were hollow, empty, yet filled with a hunger that made my blood run cold. It leaned in close, and I could smell its rancid breath, like rotting meat and decay. Then the ranger spoke again, his voice echoing through the clearing. "They feed on fear, on flesh. You didn't listen. Now you'll stay here. Forever." I don't remember much after that, just fragments, a blur of movement, the feeling of being dragged, the screams, Jake's screams echoing in my ears. When I came to, I was alone. No creatures, no ranger, no Jake, just silence. I stumbled back to civilization, half-starved and wild-eyed, rambling about monsters in the woods. They found me a day later, wandering along an old dirt road. I tried to tell them, but no one believed me. They said Jake must have gotten lost, that he was still out there somewhere. But I know the truth. I went back once a few weeks ago just to see. The lake was gone, replaced by a barren clearing, and there was no sign of our campsite. But as I turned to leave, I saw it. A sign nailed to a tree, old and weathered, with a warning scratched into the wood. "Beware the woods, they hunger for those who do not listen." So if you ever find yourself in the deep woods, remember this. When the ranger tells you to leave, listen. Because if you don't, you might not make it out alive. And if you do, you'll never be the same again. I'd been looking forward to this camping trip for months. I needed the time away from work, away from the noise of the city. Just me, my old tent, and the endless forest around me. The plan was to spend 3 nights in the deep woods of Pine Hollow National Park, miles from the nearest trailhead. I'd heard rumors about strange things happening here, but I brushed them off as local folklore. In fact, the stories only made the place more appealing. There's a kind of thrill in walking into the unknown. The first day was beautiful. I set up camp near a small trickling creek and spent the day hiking and breathing in the pine-scented air. By evening I was relaxed, listening to the crackling of my campfire and the distant hoots of owls. But as the fire died down and I lay in my tent, the forest around me seemed to change. It was no longer inviting. Instead, it felt watchful, like it was holding its breath. The first strange sound came around midnight. It was faint at first, a low, guttural growl echoing through the trees. I thought it might be a bear, so I stayed quiet, listening, hoping it would move along. But the growl was soon followed by a sound that sent chills down my spine. It was a high-pitched, almost human scream, but warped, as if someone were playing a recording backward. I lay there, heart pounding, staring up at the thin fabric of my tent, barely breathing. I knew no animal in these woods could make that sound. The following morning I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, but as I packed up my things to go explore, I noticed something strange. Just outside my tent were tracks, huge paw prints, but not like any I'd ever seen before. They were elongated, almost like a human hand, with claw marks that dug deep into the earth. The more I stared at them, the less sense they made. They looked too big to be from any known predator. The second night was worse. I had moved deeper into the forest, hoping to shake off the eerie feeling that had followed me all day. I'd barely managed to fall asleep when I heard it again. That growling, raspy and guttural, like it was coming from all around me. Then I saw it. A pair of yellow eyes gleaming in the dark, just beyond the firelight. I held my breath, terrified to move. The eyes blinked once, then vanished, only to reappear closer, and then closer still. I fumbled for my flashlight, shining it into the trees. I caught a glimpse of a shape, something tall and lean, with long, twisted limbs that seemed wrong somehow, like they weren't made to bend that way. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't listen. It was like my limbs were frozen. I could only watch as the creature stepped closer, its mouth opening to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows. In the morning, I stumbled out of my tent, packing up quickly, ready to leave. I didn't care about finishing my trip. I just needed to get out of those woods. But as I started walking, I ran into a park ranger. He was tall, dressed in the usual uniform with a rifle slung over his shoulder. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice calm but distant, like he already knew what I'd seen. "Yeah, you could say that," I replied, grateful for the company. "I think there's something out here. I saw something." He nodded slowly. "You'd best be careful in these parts. There are things in these woods that most folks don't believe in until it's too late." I shivered, but he continued walking with me, guiding me back toward the trailhead. The trees seemed to close in around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced over at him, and something about his expression didn't sit right. His eyes seemed off, almost too dark, and his movements had an unnatural stiffness. We reached a clearing, and I finally dared to ask, "Do you know what's out here? I heard stories about skinwalkers and dogmen." The ranger stopped, turning to face me. His lips twisted into a smile, but it was wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. "Those are just stories," he said, but his voice sounded different now, deeper, almost echoing. It hit me then like a punch to the gut. His skin didn't look right. It was like a mask, stretched too tightly over his face with patches that didn't quite match. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at wasn't a ranger at all. I took a step back, heart racing, but the thing in front of me reached out, its fingers stretching and elongating, claws emerging from beneath the illusion of human skin. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches clawing at me, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I burst out onto the main road where my car was parked. As I drove away, I glanced back one last time, expecting to see the creature emerging from the trees. But the woods were silent and still, as if nothing had ever been there. It wasn't until I was miles away, safe in the glare of streetlights, that I noticed the claw marks etched into my arms, a reminder that what I'd seen was real. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those woods. All I know is that it wasn't human, and whatever it was, it's still out there, lurking among the trees, waiting for the next unsuspecting camper to stumble into its territory. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods of Pine Hollow, be careful. You might just meet a ranger who isn't quite what he seems. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those woods. All I know is that it wasn't human. And whatever it was, it's still out there, lurking among the trees, waiting for the next unsuspecting camper to stumble into its territory. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods of Pine Hollow, be careful. You might just meet a ranger who isn't quite what he seems. I thought a weekend alone in the isolated stretch of red pine woods would clear my mind. The quiet, untouched wilderness seemed like the perfect escape from the constant noise of the city. So, I packed my gear, left my phone in the car, and hiked deeper into the forest than most dared to go. They say there's an old park ranger station out here, abandoned for years. It sounded like the ideal place to set up camp and enjoy the solitude. I found the station just as dusk settled in, a weather-beaten structure half hidden behind a curtain of overgrown trees and thorny bushes. The windows were shattered, the door hanging from its hinges, but there was something oddly welcoming about it. I pitched my tent nearby and started a fire as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the woods into shadow. Night fell hard, bringing with it an unsettling silence that blanketed the forest. But then, from somewhere deep in the trees, came a sound, a low, mournful wail that echoed through the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but there was something too deliberate, too mournful about it. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around myself, but I refused to let fear get the best of me. After all, I'd come here for peace, and I was determined to find it. Then, out of nowhere, a voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, and there he was, a tall, thin man in a park ranger uniform, standing just at the edge of the firelight. His face was mostly shadowed by his hat, but I could feel his eyes boring into me. "Sorry, I didn't know anyone still worked out here," I replied, forcing a smile. "I thought the station was abandoned." He tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to remember how to make a human expression. "It is." His voice was raspy, almost broken, as though he hadn't used it in a long time. "But you need to leave. There are things out here that don't take kindly to strangers." I chuckled nervously. "What, like bears?" He shook his head slowly, and for a moment I thought I saw his face twitch as if it were shifting beneath his skin. "You won't find any bears out here, just things that pretend to be them." My smile faded. The fire popped and crackled, casting strange, flickering shadows that seemed to twist around him, clinging to his form. "Look, I'll be gone by morning. I just wanted one night out here." The ranger took a step forward, and for the first time I noticed his boots didn't make a sound on the ground. It was as if he weren't even there, just a mirage created by the flickering flames. He turned almost reluctantly and melted back into the woods, leaving me alone again. I exhaled, trying to convince myself he was just an old hermit, someone who had spent too long in the forest. But as the hours ticked by, I found myself straining to hear even the faintest sound. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I finally managed to doze off, but not for long. I was woken by a snapping branch and the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I sat up, peering into the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A figure, hunched and deformed, standing just outside my tent. It looked like the ranger, but its limbs were too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, as if its neck were broken. "Leave," it hissed, but the voice was wrong, distorted. It didn't sound like the ranger anymore, it sounded like me. It was my voice, echoing back at me from those twisted lips. I scrambled out of the tent, grabbing my flashlight, and pointed it toward the figure, but it was gone, leaving only the empty forest and the suffocating darkness. I ran, not even bothering to grab my things. I needed to get back to my car, back to safety. But as I stumbled through the woods, I kept hearing it. My own voice, calling to me, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right. I'd shine my flashlight, but there'd be nothing. Then I'd hear it again, just behind me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the only thing that made sense was to keep moving, to keep running. I could see the faint glow of dawn breaking through the trees when I heard footsteps in front of me. I stopped, holding my breath as the figure emerged from the shadows. It was the ranger again. His hat was gone, and his face, I couldn't even call it a face anymore. His skin was stretched and torn, barely clinging to his skull, and his eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in the light. He raised a hand, and I could see that his fingers were elongated, ending in sharp, bone-like claws. "You can't leave," he whispered, and this time his voice was layered, like there were a dozen voices speaking in unison. I turned to run, but he was faster, darting around me, blocking my path. And then I saw it. The thing I'd been running from wasn't outside me. It was inside. My skin began to itch, my limbs tingling as if they didn't belong to me anymore. I looked down, and my hands were changing, my fingers elongating, turning into those same twisted claws. I fell to my knees, feeling my face stretch and warp, the world blurring as my senses merged with something primal, something ancient. I could hear my own voice laughing, but it wasn't my laugh. It was the ranger's, echoing from deep within me. The last thing I remember before blacking out was his face, smiling down at me, as if he'd finally found a replacement. Now, I wander these woods, wearing this form, calling to others, drawing them in. So if you ever hear a voice in Red Pine Woods, remember, it might sound like someone you know, or maybe even like yourself. But it's not. It's me. Or maybe it's him. And we're always looking for someone new to take our place. The last place I ever thought I'd be spending a cold autumn night was an old fire tower in the middle of Raven Ridge Forest. But here I was, 3 stories above the ground, with nothing but a flashlight and a radio for company. I'd taken up a temporary job as a lookout ranger, and this was my first night on the job. It was supposed to be easy. Just keep an eye out for fires or lost hikers, that sort of thing. But by midnight, I realized something was off. The forest below was unnaturally still. I'd heard that Raven Ridge was haunted by creatures that were better left unseen, and at first I brushed it off as campfire stories. But something about that silence was different. It wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard it, a faint, distorted call for help. It was just loud enough to catch my attention, but too far away to be clear. I grabbed the radio and called down to the main station, letting them know I might have a lost hiker out there. The ranger on the other end of the line, Bill, just chuckled. "Good luck with that, kid," he said, his voice crackling over the static. "Raven Ridge has a habit of playing tricks on people. Best advice, don't go chasing after anything you hear." I rolled my eyes and signed off, annoyed. But as the minutes passed, the call for help got louder, more desperate. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and started down the narrow metal staircase, every step echoing in the quiet. Once I reached the ground, I followed the sound through the underbrush, keeping my flashlight low. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together to blot out the moonlight. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but that voice kept calling, pulling me deeper into the forest. It sounded like a young woman, her voice trembling with fear, and it was getting closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. I scanned the trees with my flashlight, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound, just the thick, stifling darkness pressing in around me. I turned back the way I came, but the trail was gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed it up, leaving me stranded with no sense of direction. Panic started to creep in, and I called out, hoping maybe Bill or one of the other rangers would hear me. But instead of a response, I was met with a chilling, guttural growl from somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest as the growling grew louder, closer. I spun around, my flashlight darting through the trees, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall and emaciated, hunched over in the shadows. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its limbs were twisted, as if they'd been broken and reset in all the wrong places. It took a step toward me, its body moving in jerky, unnatural motions. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on it, but it kept coming, shambling closer, its mouth hanging open in a twisted, slack-jawed grin. And then it spoke, its voice an eerie echo of the woman's cries for help. "Please, help me." The words were distorted, unnatural, like it was struggling to form them with a mouth that didn't quite know how to make human sounds. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I ended up as long as it was far away from that thing. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept going, blindly stumbling through the forest. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps heavy and uneven, but I didn't dare look back. Finally, I burst into a clearing, the fire tower looming up ahead. I ran to the ladder and scrambled up as fast as I could, my hands slipping on the cold metal rungs. I reached the top, bolted the door, and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. I thought I was safe. But then I heard the footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the tower. The radio crackled to life, and Bill's voice came through, sounding more worried than I'd ever heard him. "Kid, you need to get out of there. Now. We just got a report that a hiker went missing in those woods last night. They found her body about an hour ago. She's been dead for days." A chill ran down my spine, and I turned to look out the window. The figure was standing at the base of the tower, staring up at me, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. It raised one twisted arm and waved, a slow, mocking gesture. And then, in that same distorted voice, it called up to me, mimicking Bill's words, "Get out of there. Now." I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't go down. The thing was blocking the only way out. I grabbed the radio again, my hands shaking as I tried to reach anyone who might be listening. But all I got was static, and then faintly beneath the crackling, that same distorted voice. "Please, help me." I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I made it back to the main station, though I don't remember the walk. I was in a daze, my mind blank, my body numb. Bill said he found me wandering along the edge of the forest at dawn, muttering to myself. I quit the job the next day. I couldn't go back there, not after what I'd seen. But sometimes in the dead of night I still hear that voice, calling out for help from the depths of the forest. And I know that whatever it is, it's still out there waiting, using that poor woman's voice to lure in anyone foolish enough to listen. And now, when I close my eyes, I see its twisted grin and those glowing eyes, watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to come back. We were 6 hours deep into the forest when we finally set up camp. The sun was already sinking behind the trees, casting long, creeping shadows across the ground. I was with my best friends, Mike, Sarah, Jenna, and Paul, and we were ready for a weekend of total disconnect. No phones, no distractions, just the 5 of us, a campfire, and miles of wilderness. It was Mike's idea to camp out here, a place called Blackwood Forest. None of us had heard of it before, but Mike swore he'd seen it online. A hidden gem. Remote. Untouched. The perfect escape. By the time we got the fire going, the woods were already dark. The kind of darkness that wraps around you makes you feel small. Sarah pulled out her guitar, strumming lazily while the rest of us sat around the fire talking and laughing. For a while, everything was perfect, peaceful even. Then, just as Jenna was telling a story, we heard it. A snap, like a twig breaking. We all froze, our eyes darting into the trees. At first, we brushed it off. It's a forest, right? Could have been an animal. But it was followed by another snap, and then another. Closer. Paul stood up, his face set in that familiar, overconfident grin. "Relax. It's probably a deer or something," he said, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the noise. The beam of light barely pierced the blackness. We waited in tense silence, listening to Paul call out, "Here, Bambi, Bambi," mocking the tension. But then he stopped. The light clicked off and there was nothing but silence. We called his name, once, twice, but no answer. Mike stood up, worry creeping across his face. "Paul, man, quit screwing around." Still nothing. The seconds stretched into minutes. My pulse started racing. Then Paul came running back into the firelight, his face pale. There's something out there," he panted. His voice cracked in a way that made my stomach drop. Before we could question him, a low guttural growl came from the trees. It wasn't the growl of any animal I knew. It was deep, unnatural, like something big, something watching us. We doused the fire quickly, plunging the campsite into darkness, hoping whatever it was would lose interest. But the noises continued, crunching leaves, the sound of something huge moving just out of sight, circling. Sarah whispered, "We need to leave. Now." No one argued. We packed up as fast as we could, our breaths coming quick and shallow, the sounds in the woods growing louder, closer. But every time we thought we were ready to run, another noise would stop us dead in our tracks, a scraping like claws against bark, or the faintest of whispers carried on the wind. We finally started hiking back, but it was slow going. Our flashlights barely illuminated the narrow trail, and the sense of being watched never left. In fact, it grew stronger. Every now and then, I swore I saw something moving just out of the corner of my eye. A shadow slipping between the trees. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. Just black. Then we stumbled upon it, a clearing that wasn't there before. We had hiked this trail earlier in the day, and there hadn't been any clearing like this. It was strange, perfectly circular, as if something had cleared it by force. In the center was a large, ancient-looking stone, half buried in the ground. Symbols were carved into it. Symbols I didn't recognize, but that made my skin crawl, just looking at them. "What the hell is this?" Mike whispered, but none of us had an answer. We all stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Then we saw the figures. At the edge of the clearing, standing motionless, were shapes, human-like but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us. "We need to go," Sarah said again, her voice shaking, but something kept us rooted to the spot. I couldn't look away. My body felt like it wasn't mine anymore, like something was holding me there, forcing me to stay. That's when I noticed it, the markings on the stone. They weren't just random symbols. They were faces, and one of them was mine. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and looked at the others. Their faces were there too. We had been marked. I don't remember much of what happened next. Everything became a blur of running, the shadows moving closer, the figures breaking the tree line, coming for us. My legs burned as I sprinted, my lungs screaming for air. We didn't stop until we reached the car, breathless, terrified. We drove all night, silent, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us. When we finally made it back to civilization, no one spoke of the figures, the stone, or the fact that we had been marked. Weeks passed, and I thought maybe it was over. Maybe we had escaped. But then Paul went missing, and Jenna. One by one, they disappeared. No traces, no clues, just gone. Now I'm the last one left. I haven't slept in days. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. The figures, standing at the edge of the clearing, waiting. I know they'll come for me soon, because sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I hear it again. That low, unnatural growl coming from the darkness. I've always preferred camping alone. Something about the isolation, the quiet, the freedom to move at my own pace, always felt like the purest way to experience the wilderness. No distractions, just me and nature. It was supposed to be peaceful. This time, though, it wasn't. I had planned a solo camping trip deep into the Rockies. The spot I'd chosen was miles away from the nearest trailhead, a small secluded clearing beside a river. I'd been there once before, years ago, and remembered it being a perfect escape. No cell service, no hikers, no people, just me and the forest. That's exactly what I needed. The hike in was long but uneventful. The sun was setting as I reached the clearing, casting an orange glow over the trees and the rushing water. I set up camp quickly, eager to settle in for the night. My fire crackled as the darkness fell around me, the woods alive with the usual sounds. Crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, the gurgle of the river. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was subtle at first, just a feeling really. Like the air was heavier, or the night was darker than usual. I chalked it up to being alone. After all, the mind plays tricks when you're isolated. But as the hours went by, the unease grew. It started with the shadows. I was sitting by the fire, eating a quick meal, when I noticed them. At first, I thought it was just the flickering flames casting strange shapes on the trees, but something about the way the shadows moved caught my attention. They didn't seem to match the rhythm of the fire. They shifted, danced, but not with the wind. They seemed deliberate. I stared at them for a while, convinced my mind was playing tricks, but the longer I watched, the more certain I became. The shadows were moving. Slowly, yes, but with purpose. I couldn't see what was casting them, only that they were there and they were getting closer. I forced myself to look away. It was late, I was tired, and the isolation was messing with my head. That's all it was. I threw another log on the fire and turned my back to the shadows, focusing on the warmth of the flames, the comfort of routine. But the feeling didn't go away, that creeping sensation of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond the light. I told myself to sleep. The fire was enough to keep anything at bay, if there was anything at all. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there, listening to the crackling fire and the steady rush of the river. It wasn't long before I heard something else. Footsteps. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Slow, cautious steps, like someone or something was creeping around my campsite. My breath caught in my throat as I lay there, frozen, listening. The steps were deliberate, moving in a slow circle just outside the firelight. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded human. I gripped the knife I kept beside me, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped right by the edge of my tent. I could hear breathing now, low, shallow breaths like someone was standing just inches away from the fabric, watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, to jump up, but I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing. The breathing grew louder, more deliberate. It felt like an eternity lying there, listening to whatever was outside my tent, waiting for it to make a move. Then, as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. The footsteps resumed, slow and steady, retreating back toward the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, clutching my knife, my ears straining to hear any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the crackling fire and the river. I waited until the first light of dawn before daring to step outside. The campsite looked normal, no signs of anyone or anything around. The fire had burned down to embers, the river still flowed peacefully. But the air was thick with that same unease, that feeling that something was wrong. Then I saw it. Just outside the clearing, right where the shadows had been moving the night before, I found them. Footprints. Human footprints. Bare, like someone had been walking without shoes. They circled my campsite just as I had heard, stopping right where my tent had been. My blood ran cold. I packed up as quickly as I could, throwing everything into my pack without caring if it was organized. I didn't want to be there any longer than necessary. As I moved to leave, something caught my eye, a small object hanging from a tree at the edge of the clearing. It was a bundle of sticks, tied together with what looked like strips of cloth. Old, tattered cloth, stained dark. It swung gently in the breeze, like some kind of twisted ornament. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to know what it meant. I just wanted to leave. The hike back to the trailhead was a blur. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I didn't stop, didn't look back, until I was safely in my car, miles away from that clearing. I still don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, the isolation getting the better of me. But those footprints, they were real. And sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I swear I hear those same slow, deliberate footsteps outside my window.